Welcome to the Pistis With Us podcast, where our faith unites us in conversation. You can expect thought-provoking discussions with theologians, pastors, scholars, and all other Christians who share the testimony of God's amazing grace. We invite you to be a part of our community to share your thoughts, questions, and stories. Join the conversation. Welcome to another episode of the Pistis With Us podcast. I'm your host, Raleigh Clay, and I am joined today by Dr. Lynn Cohick, who is a distinguished professor of New Testament and director of Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University. So Dr. Cohick, thanks so much. This is such an honor for me to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. And please call me Lynn. Thank you, Raleigh, for inviting me. You know, I love talking about the Bible, so this is awesome.
Well, we're going to do that today. Spending a certain amount of time, particularly on your contribution to Vindicating the Vixens, edited by Dr. Sandra Glahn, who we've had on a couple of times now. And what you wrote about and the person that you wrote about is so fascinating in so many different ways. And your chapter in the book was very concise. So I would actually like to unpack some more of the kind of issues that are going on, maybe surrounding the Samaritan woman or the woman at the well, and talking about that. So if you were just to explain in broad strokes the story to somebody who hasn't heard it, how would you do that?
Yeah, so the Samaritan woman is a story that takes place during Jesus' ministry as he travels from town to town. This particular town is made up of Samaritans, not Jews, and it's important to know. So if I'm telling the story, it'd kind of be like me as a Pittsburgh Steelers fan going to Philadelphia. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not there. And I'm sure everybody can think of a local equivalent, right? Yeah. So anyway, that kind of sets the stage. And Jesus is tired because it's about noon and it's hot weather at the time, and he's thirsty. And a woman comes to the well, and Jesus asks her for a drink. And from there, they start this conversation. Remember, she's Samaritan, and there are different food laws and dietary practices and piety practices that differentiate Jews and Samaritans. So they have this conversation. There's also similarity between Jews and Christians, particularly the 5 books of Moses. Both groups hold that is the word of God, and the Samaritans will call themselves Israelites. So you've got this conversation going that both accents differences and similarities. So as I'd be telling the story, I'd say, it starts out that a man is thirsty and a woman is wondering why he is asking her for a drink, and it extends then into this really deep theological discussion. And at the end of which she realizes this man is the Messiah, and she goes back to her town of the that is made up of Samaritans, presents her finding, if you will, her discovery of this man who she says this is the Messiah, and the town believes and goes out and sees Jesus. It's one of the earliest big conversions, if you will, a whole town converting. So that's how I would tell the story. And I probably also, in continuation of the story, talk about the disciples who had, in the meantime, gone into the town to buy food. They come back just as the woman is leaving. So if you're putting this in a stage production, she leaves off one side of the stage as the disciples come on the other side. There's very little crossover. And then Jesus teaches about evangelism, and the harvest is ready, right? The fields are ripe.
Right.
And so anyway, that's kind of how this story unfolds. Those are the key, the plot line, if you will, and the key characters.
So there's so much like in that brief telling of the story that we can unpack. So let's start. And you mentioned that Jews and Samaritans don't like each other. But can you talk about why they don't like each other? And this is going to go back into Old Testament history, obviously, but for our audience's sake, to understand what's going on.
Well, you're right. It is back into the Old Testament when you have the fall of the northern kingdom and you have some Israelites who remain, but who remain in such a way that they don't consider the city of Jerusalem to be central.
Right.
And so, and other things. We have we have texts that people have called the Samaritan Pentateuch, which are copies of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, books of Moses. And there are some textual differences in their copy, kind of like if they use the NIV and somebody else used the ESV, it's that kind of thing.
Right.
So they have the Bible, but they interpret it differently, and they understand themselves to be Israelites. That's how they identify themselves. So their heritage, they see themselves like this woman said, this is Jacob's well.
Right.
Like this is she calls Jacob her father. This is in chapter 4, verse 12. She asked Jesus, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? This is the 5 books of Moses. That's their story also. They're just not privileging the Jerusalem temple.
Right.
But even so there's the Old Testament background to this. But even more recently, in the maybe 110 BC, there was a Jewish king. There was, at that time, there was the Hasmonean dynasty that ruled for about 100 years, ruled Judea and Galilee and all that area, about the size of Solomon's kingdom. And that's where we get Hanukkah.
Right.
The festival of Hanukkah started at that time. So Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday that isn't part of the Old Testament, but
it's really a beautiful story.
Old Testament. Yeah. So anyway, one of the kings destroys the temple that the Samaritans had erected on Mount Gerizim. And so that's a pretty recent, like I could imagine the Samaritan woman's grandfather or great-grandfather talking about this very significant disaster in their community. So the wound is raw, I guess I'd put it that way, right? It's not just 500 or 600 years ago and the Samaritans just hold a grudge. This is new. So the fact that it shouldn't surprise us then, although it might disappoint us, but it maybe shouldn't surprise us that when the disciples go into the town, they don't talk with anybody. They're not sharing the news. They're not thinking that these Samaritans have any hope of redemption, right? Because I mean, there's just a lot of bad blood that way. So that's why when Jesus sits down, he's hot and he says to her, "Would you give me a drink?" She responds, "Why would you even ask me? Because I'm a Samaritan. Wouldn't you rather just cut out your tongue than swallow water that I gave you?"
Right.
It's also the case that there are purity laws that are at play here. So we think of food laws, rightly so. It's this, like, that the Jews did not eat pork, for example. That was pretty commonly known by the Gentiles at this time. But there was also a lot of discussion about how liquid, and that would be wine and water especially, carried impurities. So let's say the woman has a jar and she fills it with water and then she pours it into a cup of Jesus. Jesus's cup would be considered clean, but when she pours her water, it's like that's a conduit to take the impurity of her vessel and pour it into Jesus's cup. Or at least that's the conversation, right? Like that's how does this happen? So part of her surprise is that he's a Jew asking her, but part of it also is this whole understanding that the culture shared about purity and impurity.
Right.
And so that's also like, you don't have anything that I could use to draw with is part of that, right? Like if you ask me to use your clean vessel and then you drink out of that, maybe that would work, but you're certainly not going to be able to use water that I collect in my vessel.
Right, which is the parenthetical statement at the end of verse 9, at least at the end of verse 9 in most translations. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, often translated some, but it has this connotation of we don't use the same utensils. Like a Jew would never touch their lips to a utensil of a Samaritan because they were considered unclean. I mean, it seems like, at least in the research that I've done in this area, that the Samaritans would have been considered unclean just like the Gentiles, if not worse, because what they've done where they were Israelites that then cohabitated and commingled with Gentiles and defiled the bloodline, basically, is part of right? Wouldn't that be part of the issue
Yes.
of what's going on here?
Certainly in the Old Testament kind of conversation, whether Samaritans married a lot of Gentiles at the time of Jesus, I don't know. They may have stayed within their ethnic group,
Sure,
which would have been pretty typical for all ethnic groups,
right,
at this time. But there would have also been Roman presence
Right.
in Samaria. And so, yeah, it's very possible that there was also intermarriage. Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a background of was the contention equal on both sides from your research, or did it seem like it was heavier from the Jewish perspective, looking at Samaritans? Like, would Samaritans have viewed the Jews as unclean?
I think so.
Okay.
We just don't have records of the sort that we do have from the Jewish perspective.
Right.
They didn't fellowship together, or at least they didn't in certain areas in the diaspora, because we have synagogues of the Israelites, as they're called, who have their holy space on Mount Gerizim, separate from a synagogue of Jews. So they maintained their separateness. And presumably, one way to read that would be to say that, yeah, their animosity was strong enough that even if you didn't live in what you might call their holy land, still you maintained the distinction. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
But there were times, and Josephus, the ancient historian, Jewish historian,
right.
there are times when they might together face a common enemy.
Okay.
So, I don't know. For me, not only do I always want the Steelers to win, but I always want the New England Patriots to lose.
Yes.
Right. So whoever playing the Patriots at any given Sunday, I'm very happy to root for them.
Yes. So the enemy of my enemy,
is my friend. Yeah. So every once in a while that happens also.
Gotcha. Yeah. So with that background and kind of understanding the basis or the framework in which this conversation takes place, there's also the man-woman issue.
Well, a couple of things there. I think we have overstated the separation between male and female in the ancient world, certainly in the first century Roman imperial context. We've overstated that. So this is a public space where anybody can come at any time. It's not like they're hiding in the bushes. This is a well that's open to all. So it's not secretive. Moreover, it's very common for a man to ask a woman to do a chore like give me water. So there's not, the request is normal. The space is a very public space. Just as the disciples in the town maybe asking women who are running their own shops, can I have some fruit? Can I buy this bread? There would be interactions at this public space during daylight hours. And obviously this is, at what, noon or so. I mean,
midday at least or something, right?
Yeah, right. It's not first thing in the morning. It's broad daylight. So there's nothing secretive or untoward in that. So we've overstated the separation.
Which is not the only thing that's going to be overstated in this story.
Right.
Which is what I'm trying to probe at a little bit. I don't want to get there quite yet. But yeah, so there are several things that in the story I think have been taught in such a way that are just taken kind of for granted. And that's one of them is the harsh distinction between male and female relations, particularly in open space or public space and in the public sector, that would likely be a normal issue, whereas the Jew and Samaritan issue would actually be a confronting issue. Is that how you would maybe say that, and to clear that up?
Yes, I absolutely would. And to add that women and men follow Jesus all around Judea.
Right.
So I think we imagine that Jesus just has a couple of his bros with him,
Right.
and they camp out, and I don't know, whatever
The boys'
guys
club,
do,
yeah,
and they
right.
camp out, but that's just not how it actually worked.
Right.
What I would say here is that unlike Judea and Galilee, where Jesus went from Jewish town to Jewish town, days walk or less, there were always going to be relatives or people to show hospitality for the female disciples to stay in a space that was appropriately safe, protective of them and their modesty. So, I don't want to suggest in any way that the female and male followers of Jesus were sleeping out together under the stars.
Sure.
This is not Burning Man, although I've never been to Burning Man, but what I've heard, this is not it. Instead, it is a culturally appropriate way for both men and women to be followers of Jesus. But once you go into Samaria, that is a little bit harder for me to imagine female disciples finding a space, a comfortable space to stay. There are inns at this time. I've tried to do some work in looking at innkeepers and that sort of thing. It's hard to get a sort of just historical, abstract, journalistic review of these inns. They tend to be seen as offering all kinds of services, some of which would not be acceptable for a female disciple to, be in the building. So that, So anyway, maybe more than what your listeners want to know, but I think these things are important for us to visualize what the earliest church looked like, these followers of Jesus, because so often we just have false ideas, and they, especially when it comes to women, they just become erased from history.
Yeah, and a lot of what's going on, it seems to me, is that one, we're so far removed from it that what's not explained in the text, we have to read within the white lines some, understand the culture and historical background of what's going on that didn't need to be said when the text was written. And so there's always these cultural background, historical, societal things that are going on that inform the text. Like, I think we can make sense of most of the text, the thrust of the text, without knowing all of that stuff. But there is something that's really interesting and enlightening about understanding the historical, cultural, societal background of these things to set up why this is even such a big deal.
Well, and speaking of historical backgrounds, one of the things that often is said is that the woman is an outcast because she's coming to the well at noon. And I tried to find evidence for that in the Old Testament. It's just not there. It may be culturally true for the Bedouin culture that exists in this area today, but it's not something that would have existed in the Greco-Roman world. It's not. There are differences, and simply assuming that culture is the same in certain ways after these 2,000 years ends up usually to be wrong. Anyway, so then I started thinking, well, what would cause her to be at the well at noon? Because you hear all these things like, well, she's by herself, and women never go by themselves. And just all these things. And I think, well, yeah, but what if her neighbor asked her to run and get another jar of water because her 5 kids were running around and horse playing and all that, and they knocked over her water? Or one of her neighbors is sick and wasn't able to get to the well in the morning, and so went ahead. One of the things, I lived in Kenya, our family was in Kenya for a couple of years, and we lived in a rural area, and the women would wash their clothes at a really tiny creek, they called it. I'm from Pennsylvania, where there's a lot more water, so this was just almost like just a little creek or ditch or whatever. I mean, it was, very little water, very, very little water. But they would go down to this water and they would wash their clothes. And sometimes they would do it, like, let's say at 3 p.m, and they'd wring out the clothes and then they'd hang them on the bushes, just like drape them over bushes so that the sun would dry the clothes. Now, their clothes, you can't wring out clothes, hand wring clothes to the same degree that a washer can spin clothes.
Right.
So they were more wet than what you and I would pull out of our washing machines. And they were draped on these bushes, but the sun then went down around 6 o'clock all the time because we were about right on the equator, which meant they only had about 3 hours to dry, which meant the women often just left the clothes there and then next day went back and got them, or brought the wet clothes back and then the next day put them out. In other words, it was very inefficient. As an American.
Right.
Well, as Americans, we have as the 11th commandment, thou shalt be efficient.
Efficiency above everything.
Right. We look at that and we think, well, my word, why didn't they go at 9 a.m., right? It's cooler then and they could get it all done. And the answer is because their culture doesn't privilege efficiency. And they're not, I mean, it's my culture that is imposing this industrialized sort of mindset that we get so used to. And my way's not better or worse than my Kenyan lady friends is. All that to say, though, it really showed me that this woman could be at the well getting water for any number of perfectly reasonable reasons, and she could be doing it on her own in absolute safety. So this idea that she's an outcast is an unfortunate layering on top of her, something that I doubt is the case, especially because we get to the end of the story, the townspeople believe her. And it's just really unusual for townspeople to believe an outcast woman. They usually bring her up as a witch. They're not going to believe her.
Yeah, especially if she's an outcast in the sense that a lot have, or I mean, even in my tradition growing up, how I've been taught this story, and like if she really was as promiscuous as the tradition makes her out to be, like her testimony wouldn't be valid in any kind of court situation. So why would they believe her if she's saying that Messiah, who I would assume the Samaritans were looking for as well, like not just the Jews, but like they're longing in expectation of Messiah. And it seems like that, at least from her, like just the way she's interacting with Jesus, they're looking for him. And so, yeah, it seems really, when you actually just pull the story out from itself a little bit and just read what John has set forth in the text, some of those things seem they start to become contradictory. That if she is this outcast, not the text itself, but what's been done in the text, if she is this outcast who had to come later than everybody else because no woman would want to be around her and all this, it seems really interesting that the town responds the way that they do.
Yes, and especially when she is not changed like you would have the Gerasene demoniac. Like he changes. The text tells us that, and everyone is amazed. But that does not happen with the Samaritan woman. Yeah. So I agree. I think the idea that we're probably going to get to her marital history, so I'll save it for your question. But that plays up too.
Where does this thought come from that she's this sinful, promiscuous woman. Like, which is there an early church father or early a patristic theologian who starts us on that path? I couldn't find any definitive, and maybe that's just my bad research, but I couldn't find any definitive like mark to whereas like Origen says this or Jerome had this comment about the text or something like that.
No, I agree with you. Off the top of my head, I can't think of that either. What they end up sometimes doing is changing that her husbands are not actual men, but they allegorize. So they become, different things. So
Right.
that, but the early church was more comfortable, and on up through the Middle Ages, was more comfortable with the idea of illumination, that someone, when they meet Christ, can develop an understanding. And when you get to the Reformation, and let's just say Calvin, they saw salvation as a moment where you had understood yourself as a sinner, you see God's grace, so you repent, and then you're saved. And with this woman, that's not how the story unfolds. There's a conversation. And then she comes to this realization. And that just doesn't map neatly onto the Reformation's view of how salvation would be. So that's where you start to have an increase in the negative interpretations of her. Because everybody had to realize just what an awful sinner they were before they then received God's grace. And so her marital history then was interpreted as being very sinful, and other things kind of layered on that then to kind of fit into this prepackaged understanding of what salvation has to be.
Right. And I didn't look into it a whole lot, and so I wasn't sure if you came across it, but part of me started to think that maybe Augustine might have worked through it that way because of his past and coming to see the story, and because he kind of started on this track of a conversion experience, kind of, and really recognizing himself as dead in sin and needing to be made alive, and like some of that kind of language that comes out of Augustinian thought. And so, but I couldn't find anything that I was just like, okay, yeah, and again, maybe I overlooked something. So I wasn't sure if it was somebody like really early on.
I don't think so, but I could be wrong on that. I don't think so. She becomes, we know her as unnamed.
Right.
But early in church history, she does receive a name, light, illumination, kind of a name that reflects that. And so the early up through the medieval church would have seen her as a saint. So that may also be in part why Augustine might be hinting at that you correctly observed what he's doing, but wouldn't necessarily read her quite that way, right. Because of the grace that the church dispenses, which Augustine would be comfortable with, right. In ways that later, by the time you get to Luther and Calvin,
right.
Things are a bit different, and so they have a critique. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense, in that some of that would come about more through the Reformation period. That, So okay, so that'll bring us, I think, right into talking about the marital relationships, or relations that the text is very. It doesn't really say much. In Jesus' statement to her of her past husbands has no connotation of how those relationships ended.
Nope.
Which I'm embarrassed to say this honestly, but it wasn't until maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I even recognized that. Because you grow up and you're taught something and you just see it, like in the text, you don't question it, and unless you actually stand back and say, wait a second, Why do we just take for granted that she was this promiscuous woman? And you bring up a couple of points. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but you bring up a couple of points that when I read it, I was like, yeah, those were the same things that I started thinking. And so I'll let you go. I don't want to steal your thunder from it. So yeah, can you talk about those marriage relationships, how that would have worked back then, and kind of build a platform for maybe how we can take this that's maybe more appropriate to the text?
Sure. Well, I would say first and foremost, what we have to realize is that women at this time could not represent themselves in court. They needed to have a male guardian, and it could be an uncle, could be their husband, could be a brother, could be a friend. That would represent them in court. So while a woman could separate from her husband, move to another location, that she could not divorce. And in fact, when they talk about marriage in the New Testament, and you're going to talk about a woman, it's always in the past, not always, I'm sure there are exceptions, but usually it's in the passive. She was married to. But if you're talking about a man, you would say he married her. But you wouldn't say she married him.
That's interesting.
Because that's attributes an agency to a woman that just simply isn't legally or culturally there. So first of all, to say you have had 5 husbands as though she went out and married and divorced, something like Liz Taylor or something, Elizabeth Taylor back in the day. And there's probably newer, beautiful women who have, had a number of different husbands and can, in our legal system, represent themselves. That's just not a helpful lens to look at the ancient world. So you think, okay, was she divorced 5 times? Okay, that meant that in this small town, there were 5 different men who sequentially decided, yep, I'm going to marry this woman who was divorced. And there's some people say, well, maybe she was divorced all those times because of barrenness. And I kind of chuckle, think, everyone back then realized life is short. So what guy is going to say, no, I know that I'll be the lucky one. Right. I just don't see it, right? Not after the 3rd one. They've got, they got to live their life, and they're not going to waste time with that.
Right. And wait, before you go on, so you've said this a couple of times, and just maybe for our audience to understand, what size, like in terms of population, what would you say? Because we often think towns or cities in our context, and like we have much greater population in our small towns that they would have had maybe in even some of their bigger locations. So what would you just rough so the audience kind of gets an idea of, like, she would have been known within the town?
To everyone. That's such a great question, and I feel so bad that I can't just pull a number. 50 families, maybe. Could there have been 1,000? I don't know. I mean, 100 families. Trying to think how big Nazareth would be. We're going to have one of the listeners Google that and then get back to you.
It would be a good research question, I think, when we're just to get a perspective of the size of the town that we're talking if she's barren and she's had, from what you're going on here, 1 or 2 husbands, and then say the 3rd guy does, like, I'm going to be the one that's gonna impregnate her and have offspring with her, that, like, this would be a huge gamble,
right,
for a short lifespan. And so, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Nope, that's exactly right. And I'm glad you asked the question about the number of families. I just don't know, but that's crucial. We have to think really, really small,
right, with
everyone knowing everyone else.
Right.
Well, and so we have, I think, the unlikelihood that she was divorced 5 times. And I use the passive there, because passive verb form, because that's what would have needed to happen. So maybe she's a widow. And I think that's more likely that she is a widow, potentially even 5 times. Although that also, I don't know, like I could see maybe one divorce early on, and then a couple of her husbands died. Probably is more of a mixture. Remember in the Gospels, there's the Sadducees that come to Jesus and say, who will this woman be married to? You know, she had to marry all those brothers
and,
in the Levirate system. And clearly it's just an abstract question, but it has force in part because the death rate is so high.
The validity behind it made sense, at least in the questioning, even if it was hypothetical.
But I think the other thing is with the number, that 5 husbands, I couldn't find any other person in the ancient world at this time, 1st century or thereabouts, that had 5 spouses, except Agrippa, who was very good friends with Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And when he died, he was married to his 5th wife. A couple of them died, a couple of them he divorced. That's an extraordinary number, very high number. A more typical number would be 2, maybe 3.
And then you're talking about a male to a female. Like you're talking about a husband to a wife at that point, which would make more logical sense that he could, like, even if it's not the norm, that he could have that many wives or something like that, than a wife having that many husbands. Would that be fair?
I think so, yes. Although I think it's Berenice, the princess, as part of the Herodian family. She has 3 husbands and divorces the 3rd when she's rather young. Then she never marries again. So it's possible if you start very young, which a lot of women are married in their late teens. The point I think that at least she picks up in the story that we often miss is that Jesus knows this number. Like if Jesus has said, that's right, you've had 3 husbands, it'd be like, yeah, yawn, you know, because that'd be a good guess.
Right.
But to say 5, that's is what she sees, which is he is a prophet. Like he knows my life story. So that, that's, I think, where I would go with the husband's part of things. One more note is that families were involved in setting up relationships, and it may be that she had help from uncles and others in making some of these alliances, these marriages. So just something to think about. Again, we put all this weight on her as though she was making these decisions about marriage, divorce unilaterally and with full legal capacity. And that's just simply, not going to be the case. I remember a story from when I lived in Kenya of a woman who, she lived about a 2 hours walk from where I lived, and she would bring vegetables like pumpkins and onions and potatoes to sell, carrots, and she'd sell them house to house on the mission compound where we lived. So we were there working at a hospital. And anyway, I remember her telling me the story. She, in her first marriage, had 4 kids, and then her husband died. So she might have been like in her 30s, and her family arranged another marriage for her so that her children could have the honor of having a father in the home. And they brought forward a man who might have been in his 70s at that time. When I saw him, he had the sweetest smile, and he was so bent over, and he looked, like Methuselah, but very dear, just so dear, and what a gracious host. But at first, my friend, she said to me when she first was told, this will be your new husband, she was a bit downcast. She said rather, understandably there. But then she got serious and she said, but I could see wisdom that my parents had because he was a good man and he'd bring honor to the children. So she ended up marrying him. And it just opened my eyes to the different ways that cultures manage marriage and keeping families together and raising kids and the whole, honor and all of that.
Right.
And I think it's important for us when we look at the Samaritan woman and her family history of marriage to recognize the kinds of things that would happen in the ancient world. She just wouldn't have been alone in making a lot of these decisions. There have been others who were speaking into her life and maybe even making decisions for her.
Right. Yeah, and it's easy from our place in history to look back and just like read or see these people through the lens in which we see our own world, and it really takes some time to step away from that and really try to understand what's going on in that cultural context that enlightens the story itself, but then also doesn't treat the people in the story as just characters. This is a real interaction that's happening between this woman that, if she's lost 5 husbands, in whatever way that she's lost them, whether it was a mixture or there's some divorce in there, but also becoming a widow several times over, which can be likely, that there's brokenness
exactly
there, and so I think at least from my former perspective in this story, what I read when she goes back and tells the town about this guy who told her everything about her life is that she's confessing sin there, but that's not what the text actually says. And so even if you just read that, it seems, and I'd like you to talk about this, but even if you just read that and understand that she's just gone back, like this guy who she just met, and their conversation is incredible, and maybe we can get there. But this guy who just met her knew that she had 5 husbands, and that's really all the context is on what Jesus tells her about herself. He doesn't say anything else, and he doesn't condemn her, and not even condemn. He doesn't say anything like he says in other areas of go and sin no more or anything like that. That should give us, if we were going to read the story that way, that would give us that kind of inclination of, oh yeah, she's, she was like the woman caught in adultery or something like that.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I think the phrase that we struggle with so much is Jesus saying, the man you have now, or the man you're with now.
Yeah.
It's pretty basic Greek. The man you have now, it is not your husband. That's a pretty okay translation, but it's not like we should again imagine that she somehow has agency in that. It's just how how the Greek describes things. But it's this, I think, that so many people point to say, well, she's living in sin with a man she's not married to. So that's, I think, where the prostitute-like kind of thing comes up. And I think, again, there could be a couple of other ways of looking at this rather than Jesus pointing out her sin, especially because he says to her, what you've told me is true. And the word true that we have here, which is a key word in John's gospel, is a positive word all over. So it strengthens the point you were making. This is, she's not being chastised. She doesn't sense that. And Jesus, I think, by using what you've said is true, is reaffirming this is her history. So then we have to say, then we have to look closely at the ancient culture yet again and what we find even in funerary inscriptions is that women, to a much larger degree than men, are defined by their family, who they were married to, who their father was, who their son was. So males in their family. Men can be much more connected with what they did or what kind of title they might have had if they were in the military or something like that. So so Jesus giving her marital history is how women told their story, right? It is how they, it's what gave them social identity,
right.
which is different than what it does for men. But the concept of Jesus knowing who you are, we see that at the beginning of the Gospel of John when Jesus meets Nathanael, right? And he says, oh, there's an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, to which Nathanael, in a very non-evangelical sense, says, oh yeah, I'm that. I absolutely don't have deceit, right? You know, I always think, man, if Jesus said that to us today, we'd be like, no, I really,
you don't know me that well.
Yeah, you know, and kind of shuffle our feet a little.
Right.
But Nathanael realized exactly what Jesus was saying, which is that here's a devout person, and he uses the word Israelite, which is a theological term. It means you are a person dedicated to being part of the people of God. Because at this time, in Jesus's day, you called those who followed the one true God Jews. Israelites were those who lived in the biblical period. There's nobody that called themselves a Jewish person that called themselves an Israelite unless they were making a theological point.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so that's what, and Nathanael responds, you are the king, right? You are the king of Israel. Well, the Samaritan woman doesn't use those exact words, but the Samaritans themselves, when they go and see Jesus, they say, here's the Savior of the world. So there's a lot of parallels between Nathanael's encounter and the Samaritan woman's encounter in the way that Jesus reveals to them their unique history, and thus reveals his own prophetic and messianic identity.
Yeah. There's a statement that she makes in verse 29 that I find fascinating because I've heard it explained a couple of different ways, and of course I have my opinion. But when she goes into the town and she says, "Come see a man who told me everything I've ever done," and then there's this phrase in English, perhaps this one is the Christ or the Messiah, and I've heard it that they wouldn't believe her, so she's trying to appeal to their ego that like maybe you should figure out if he's the Christ or something. But it almost seems more logical in my mind that this is a confession of hers, that she has encountered the one sent by God who they were waiting on.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's connected. In the English, there are two sentences is how it's done, but in the Greek, they're more closely tied together.
Right.
And so you could read it as, come and see this man who told me everything I did, with this idea of, could this man have told me everything that I did unless he is the Messiah? Right. And so the particle that has been translated in that sentence part of 29, could this be the Messiah, is trying to capture, unless, an idea of unless. So I might, how I had said it, given that he said all this, doesn't it make sense that he's the Messiah? It'd be that kind of thing, not, I really don't know. I want your opinion. I'm still kind of 50-50 on this, because especially afterwards, they say in verse 39, they believed in him because of the woman's testimony.
Right.
He told me everything I ever did.
Right.
And then they, in verse 42, they say, we no longer believe just because of what you said. We've now heard it for ourselves.
Right.
So she was compelling when she told that. She wasn't waffling. I think the other thing is to note here is this action by Jesus, that he told her everything that she did. In other words, he knew things that only a prophet could know.
Mm-hmm.
It's very compelling, not just to the Samaritans, but also to Nathanael. And I think it invites us to perhaps think, I don't know if I should say differently or broadly. I'm not sure. Think again about how we understand how one comes to faith.
Right. Yeah.
We're so used to, you got to confess your sins, as though the only way that God is going to reveal himself to you is if he convicts you of your sinful nature. And this story, as well as Nathanael's, highlights that God might instead reveal his knowledge of who you are.
Right.
Not necessarily, i.e., that you're a sinner, but just who you are in such a way that it compels belief.
Right.
And I think we can downplay woman in part because we have our own soteriological or salvation lens that are just kind of can only pick up certain bands of light, but not all the spectrum, you know.
Part of what goes into that maybe is how we have, I don't want to be too provocative when I say this, but how we've truncated the gospel message as being a message of just salvation, how one gets saved or something of that nature, to where it's much more robust than that. So when you have a particular soteriological lens through which you're looking at how this starts to come about, and I think for most of us, it's through the Reformation lens, and what's going on there. And I don't want to like downplay the necessity of the Reformation in like large strokes, but there were things that have come out from that have hindered our understanding, I think, of some of those texts. And like you can even think about Paul, like what you're doing with Nathanael. We could think about Paul in the same sense. That we often talk about Paul's experience or Saul's experience as a conversion experience, but it's not that. And I know you've done enough work in Paul to that could speak much better to that than I can. But yeah, we've started to read kind of our understanding of the gospel and what comes about in believing or surrendering ourselves to God or to Christ and who he is and all of that really kind of muddies the waters a bit when we start to look at these texts, because then we want to take that she must have recognized her sinfulness and then confessed it in some way. And so her confession of this one is the Christ, then becomes some kind of confession of sinfulness, that he's told me everything I've done. Can he be the Christ? Like, is this the but what's really interesting to me and is the parallel of the Samaritan woman with what happens in John 3, and the one that you would think would recognize the Christ doesn't. And
Right.
then the provocative story that comes from that to the Samaritan woman of, at least from a Jewish perspective, one that wouldn't recognize the Christ, and she does.
That's
And
right.
there's something really beautiful about what John is doing in the literary format in storytelling that doesn't diminish either story. That actually, because we recognize that Nicodemus later comes and like
Yep.
and all of that stuff. But there is something just remarkable about how he's placing these two stories together that just should cause us to sit with it for a second and not at all try to read into our understanding, but allow the text to transform and penetrate us.
Absolutely. And I think, we're very familiar with the dialogue that Nicodemus has with Jesus. We are not as familiar with the dialogue, which is the longest dialogue in John's gospel, between this woman and Jesus. And I think some of the reason is that we have been taught, at least I've heard it argued, that she's trying to change the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
So when he says, what you've said is true, she then responds with a question about where the holy place really should be, Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem. And it does actually frustrate me a lot when people say that, because part of it, from my standpoint, is that part of their willingness to go in that direction is they have a hard time imagining that women have theological questions. It's just hard to imagine for them that a man would want to have a theological conversation with a woman, and a woman has theological curiosity. So there, I've been a little bit, there's my little snarkiness there, right there. But I mean, I do actually think that's a lot of it. We can't imagine her conversation. Secondly, this is a huge conversation in her day. So this is incredibly relevant. She's not changing the conversation. She now sees, wow, this guy, has something. And what does he have? Well, he teaches her that true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. That is incredibly profound. And people cite this all the time, as they should, but they don't cite it as though it was just said to a Samaritan woman whose name we don't have in the biblical text.
Right.
God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and truth. That's John in a nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's his self-disclosure, Jesus' self-disclosure as well, that, I am he, right?
Right.
Ego eimi in verse 26. And so there's, I just don't buy that she twisted Jesus's focus to somehow go where Jesus didn't want to go. I mean, that's I can't imagine John, the gospel writer, thinking that. So instead, they have this amazing conversation, and that should then, I think, alert us to the women, the mothers, the daughters, the wives, the single women in our congregations who are also theologically astute. How are we encouraging them to live into the talents and the gifts that God's given them?
Yeah, that's really insightful, and a great way to respond appropriately to the text in our culture, and how we should go about understanding what's going on here, and then live into that. And just coming full circle with what you were saying when you were setting up the issue between Samaritans and Jews, in the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim and in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This is an issue, an incredibly important theological issue. So this is seemingly just a natural conversation that would have been had by, if she's looking for Messiah, and this guy's like telling her this stuff, and she at least perceives right away, you're a prophet. And if we do take that there was a silent period for a long time, just the announcement of a new prophet's a huge deal. And that this guy is going to be the mouthpiece of God, and if he's not Messiah, maybe he tells us when Messiah is coming, or whatever, or something. And so the question seems logical of how do we worship God rightly, and who's doing it?
That's right.
And Jesus's answer is incredibly profound and utterly provocative at the time. Of it's neither going to be in Jerusalem where you think God's presence is. Because actually God's presence is sitting right in front of you. It's not in the temple of Jerusalem. Yes. It's not in the temple of the Gerizim. And so, but this is it. And so if we think of even this statement, and you're right, people quote this all the time, we'll worship God in spirit and truth. And maybe rightfully so. if the context is proper for which we in which we quote that, and it seems like what Jesus is doing is broadening this movement of God and his revelation of himself into the world, that this is not just a locale anymore. That God's presence, the Old Testament dwelt tabernacle, temple, it was located one place particularly. And then Jesus steps on the scene, claims to be the temple of God, but he's mobile. It's like walking around presence of God. And then the coming of the Spirit, which is just the explosion of God's presence into the world. And so it's so theologically packed on what's going on. And I mean, we could do 2 more podcasts about the conversation itself, which it's utterly remarkable. And to recognize that this is the longest conversation that we actually have, in this kind of manner with Jesus and talking to this unnamed woman.
Yeah. And then he stays in the town. That's amazing, right? At the end, he stays there for 2 more days. I'd love to know what they talked about. I wonder if he talked with them, because this man that the woman is with is not her husband. So who is he? Is she his concubine, which would be an acceptable, from a social standpoint, an acceptable category, but it's not marriage, and so it's not God's best. Is this like, how at the end of David's life, he had a young woman lay in his bed, kind of like a hot water bottle for kings, I guess. And, is that the function that she has in this? I don't know. I could imagine a couple of scenarios that from a cultural standpoint were legitimate and didn't, she was still moral, but from God's perspective, it's not God's best, because it's not marriage, which is what God intends. So, I don't know if that's part of what Jesus talked about, as well as explaining more fully, look, you guys, don't try and rebuild on Mount Gerizim, and you don't even actually have to worry about Jerusalem, as Jesus will be later crucified, in part for saying, if you tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. So maybe he is talking about that with a little bit more fullness. And I assume the disciples of Jesus are also hanging out and listening to what he's saying. And I imagine they're really surprised. They would just not have imagined the scope of Jesus's message to have extended to this people group. And that, to me, is such an important takeaway from this story. But we don't often hear it because we're so caught up with describing this woman as a horrible sinner who is now saved by grace. And let me just say that for women to be accused of sexual sins, you never actually get clean from that. Like, I know that people love talking about, isn't that great? Now she's just completely, saved and clean. But no family is going to say, be like the Samaritan woman to their daughters, if they assume the traditional way of looking at her. She can't be a disciple that we try to follow and emulate, because you just can't get clean from being, I'm saying this in our cultural sense. Obviously, in God, of course, it's absolutely white as snow. But I'm saying in our culture, there are certain sins or behaviors or traumas that women experience in a sexual way that never get fully removed in a way that it can happen with men. So I'm especially concerned that we get her story right, so that we can see her discipleship more clearly, and then allow the church to emulate this wonderful example of hearing and then doing, which is what we're supposed to all be doing.
Well, I don't want to hold you up for longer. You've been gracious in having this conversation. So For anyone who, and I've asked everyone who's come on for this series so far to do this. So for anyone who hasn't read your chapter, doesn't know much about the Samaritan woman, to get them excited about going and actually purchasing the book, reading about the woman at the well, or people who have read it from a certain perspective. If she's not the sinful woman that she's been cast to be traditionally, how would you want people to read her story when they approach the story?
I would like them to think of her as theologically curious and as an evangelist. So she's theologically curious, and then when she gets her answers, she doesn't keep them to herself. Right. She shares them with others and brings others to Jesus. That's how I would want them to see her.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I think just when you read the text through that lens, it changes the way that the story impacts and penetrates the reader, and it's just really beautiful. So thank you for that, Dr. Cohick. Or Lynn, sorry. I didn't.
Yep. Well, and thank you, Raleigh. This was so much fun. And you're right, we could just keep going on and on. The scripture is just wonderful to dive in deep. So I love talking with you about this.
Great. Well, I do appreciate your time. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been an honor for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Pistis With Us podcast. To keep the conversation going beyond the camera, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page, as well as wherever you listen to your podcasts.